Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons, and this is Two Philosophers, One Conversation. I'm joined today by one of my friends, somebody I look up to. I have read lots of her books, and it always helps me become a better person, a better thinker, and hopefully a better member of society. Today's guest is Wendy Farley. She is a professor at University of Redlands and also holds a PhD from Vanderbilt, my alma mater. And so in that sense, hopefully I can participate in at least some of the virtue that has been cultivated there. Wendy, we are so excited to have you with us today to talk about the work that you are doing and how it can speak into the situation where we find ourselves. In particular, you've just finished this book called Beguiled by Beauty, which is all about the relationship between a contemplative set of practices and approach to life and how that might create for us a sort of compassionate mode of engaging ourselves, our God, and others. Maybe you could start by saying a little bit about that project and why you thought it needed written. What was lacking in the world such that hopefully this book can speak into that space?
We live in really hard times. And I think humanity always lives in hard times, but we have a very demoralizing political situation. We're aware of the long atrocity of race in a way that has been there, but we haven't necessarily, as white people, been as mindful of it. We're facing very severe environmental consequences. The gap between rich and poor is intense. Many of our cultural institutions are losing their power to motivate, inspire, and guide us. So we are in a moment of history, and that doesn't end. I was writing it before the pandemic. And I was aware of how demoralized people were and kind of hopeless. I've always thought that the more directly you face the truth and the truth of suffering, the truth of injustice, the more you are prepared and empowered to understand the radical goodness of ultimate reality, which sounds paradoxical, but this is the world we live in. And if we face it, then we know something more about the way reality works. Not in a superficial and cynical way, but what are the roots of goodness that one can bring to a situation like this? You don't find the roots of goodness by running away from what's hard or what's distorted. And so that was the most general genesis. I'm a philosopher and a theologian, and in the last 20 or so years have been studying contemplative practices. And for me, studying contemplative practices was in some ways a natural evolution from studying phenomenology. Particularly Husserl, but other phenomenologists really focus on what is real. They try to remove as many illusions as they can about how their mind works and look as intensely and without, as to the extent possible, removing prejudice and assumptions. What is this phenomena? So that's a spiritual practice. It's not just reading books in the library. It's a spiritual practice, because to look at something as what it is a very intense mental practice, but it requires a kind of ethical rationality, because it's not just about controlling something. It's about genuine curiosity and concern about something other than yourself. And the contemplative traditions are very interested in that. And they have thousands of years of insight into how you can watch your own mind so that you notice more and more your habits and how those habits are distorting reality.
It's fascinating that you link it to phenomenology and this idea of philosophy being a kind, as you say, of spiritual practice, which of course makes me think of, Pierre Hadot, who talks about philosophy as this way of life, and that originally philosophy wasn't a professional discourse undertaken by a bunch of PhDs sitting at a conference hotel or across Zoom. It was people living life together and trying the best they could to help each other figure out how to do it more effectively. And now when we think about that, it seems pretty far from what philosophers do and much more closely aligned with something like a retreat center or a group of people coming together in an embodied practice to create a different mode of inhabiting their space. And so it does seem to me to be a way of understanding contemplative life as this old philosophical mode of existence, right? Not some sort of, new agey way of going forward, but actually a return to an ancient idea of selfhood and community. I'm especially interested by the comment you made about the need for hope. And it's interesting that when you wrote this before the pandemic, of course, who would have even thought this was possible just a year ago? And yet here we find ourselves. And I find my students, my friends, my family, hope is the thing that we're all trying to find some way to link up with. Hope for a vaccine, hope for national leadership that will take it seriously rather than denying the suffering about which you speak. So how is it that you see contemplative engagement, and in particular the embodiment of contemplation? How does that yield an approach to hope that you find helpful?
Hope is a difficult concept. Like any important concept, it has many dimensions and meanings. So one kind of hope is, as you say, I hope something good will happen in November. I hope something will arise that will allow us to engage our race crisis with radical compassion. I hope for certain outcomes, in other words. But there's another kind of hope, and that hope may or may not be realized. And so then if our hope isn't realized, we are, in a sense, hopeless or very discouraged. But there's another kind of hope, and that is hope in the moment. And this is why contemplative practice, I think, is so powerful. The Bhagavad Gita says, you have a right to your work, but you do not have a right to the fruit of your work. And I just found this fascinating and, of course, counterintuitive. But the point is, you do what you do. And you do it because it's the right thing to do. You don't do it and then say, oh, the outcome I wish didn't happen, and so it was worthless. You do what you do because it's right. And so this notion that I worked with, this notion of being beguiled by beauty, which is a phrase from Pseudo-Dionysius, it describes God's, so to speak, motivation for creation. God is, the good beyond being is beguiled by this future beauty and called into creating the cosmos. I just love this. But for me, this work to awaken this sense of the beauty of beings, the beauty of the cosmos, the beauty of the earth, not the attractiveness of beings in a movie star sense, but that every single being, the little slug that crawls on the ground, the moss that is dying, the coral reefs that are under threat, all of the people that I think are important or I, in my ignorance, think are not important, every single being is beautiful. It has the beauty of existing. And this is why I love this ancient tradition of Pseudo-Dionysius and others. To exist is to be beautiful, to be called into beauty. And when you awaken to that, you really get outside of your own prejudices. Like, I think these people are beautiful, but these are not. These animals or beings or ecosystems are important, and these aren't. You awaken to this omnipresent goodness of creation. And then you're compelled to live as if that were true. And so when you encounter the assault or the suffering or the diminishment of beings, you can't help but respond in some way. And it may sound like I've gone a long way away from hope, but actually this is hope. this is to live a hopeful life. It's to live as if beings matter. And this or that outcome may or may not happen at this moment or in 10 years or in 50 years. I don't know that. I can't know that. And I can't make my life contingent on this or that outcome. I can participate in processes that I think might be useful in contributing to good outcomes. I should do that. But I can't make my sense of the sacredness, the goodness, the beauty, the vulnerability, the suffering of beings contingent on an outcome. And in that sense, this like dropping your roots into the goodness that is ultimate, and then acting according to this awareness of the sacred worth and goodness and beauty of every single being. That is to live a hopeful life. It's a hope that doesn't get knocked around because it's not contingent on this or that outcome. The only thing it's contingent on is the basic structure of reality as good. And that's not going to come and go.
Yeah, in a recent essay of mine for a book on liturgy, to which you're actually contributing, I talk about the way in which religious liturgies in particular invite what I refer to as an eschatological hope, which is precisely as you're describing. It's different than, a hope for this or a hope for that, but it's a hope as a mode of orientation toward that which we in some ways can't even expect. And that disposition, that hopeful openness is, I think you're exactly right, grounded in a kind of moral solidarity with everything that participates in, we might call the mortal condition, right? That our vulnerability is what invites us into that kind of hope, and then is cultivated in these sorts of practices, this contemplative engagement, liturgical engagement. That is, I think, in some ways, the heart of religious existence, instead of, propositional articulations of this or that relative to a conception of the divine, which I think is also important as a philosopher, but it can so often miss the lived dynamics of what it means to be hopeful, as opposed to simply hold hope in relation to a proposition that I affirm. And I love the way that you are navigating that. What do you find to be especially challenging for being able to maintain that kind of lived hope, for the distractions, we might say, that interrupt our contemplative spiritual practices? It seems like we've got a lot going on right now. How is it that you would speak to someone who says, look, I'm doing the best I can, I'm trying, but the world is just too much. It is too present with me for me to live in the present. How do we walk forward in the midst of so much opposition to being able to even stand?
Well, I think that's something that we always, to one degree or another, face. That there's a million things that keep us off center, whether they're minor in our personal lives or very major and in our collective life. I think one, and there are countless and probably as many responses to that as there are human beings, but I think that one thing that can make us not pursue the resource, the inner resource that we need, is that we have a fantasy about what that would be. And that fantasy is impossible. And so we say, I can't do that. Or you say, I some kind of interior work is blah, 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 some selfish navel gazing. I have work to do. I don't have time for that. So I think of, this word disposition is very helpful, but I think of it as micro moments. That is to say, when you read a book on meditation, it says you should sit down and meditate for 20 or 30 minutes twice a day. Now, I was a mother with little kids, and for much of that time, I was a functionally single parent. So this like blithe, sit down for 30 minutes twice a day. It's like that you're in a fantasy world. That is not happening. Or my mind is so distracted. I have to get Paul here, and so-and-so needs their medicine, and I have to fix dinner, and I have to grade papers. And that's a fantasy that I could spend 2 seconds attending to something that would give me resource. And so I'm very aware of if you just think in terms of there is resource and I can tap into it at any moment, then you just need a micro moment to do it. I have a memory of, the kids are little and I'm just in a mode of desperation, and I take my trash out to the curb, and it's nighttime and the stars are out. So I linger for maybe 10 extra seconds while my children wait. But that 10 seconds of just like total openness to the beauty of the sky is as good as 30 minutes of meditation. Not because of the time, but because you've opened to what is an infinite resource. And we can all find what connects us to resource. For religious people, that will be some form of ultimate reality. God, Christians and others might use the word God, but for others it would be, this fecundity, this resource, this flowing stream that never runs out. So if we just think that is real, that is available, I don't have to do anything magical to connect to that. It's there all the time. I only need 5 seconds. And I put my root, I open my heart to that dimension for the tiniest sliver of time, and I have resource.
This might be a rather unfair question because it's going to cause us to cross from theology and philosophy into what we might call the sort of sociology of religion. But I'd love your thoughts on this. Whenever we talk, like you and I, about our own being religious, our commitment to this religious sensibility, how it invites hope and compassion and develops an openness to the unknown, I could imagine lots of people, especially in our contemporary world, saying, whoa, religion can't be the answer. It's in fact one of the biggest causes of distraction and obstacle, and there's no compassion. It's actually about egoism and your own rights and not having to wear a mask and getting back to church and ignoring rules and others. It of course seems to me like a very distorted idea of religion when it's presented that way. And yet that is a very common, very prominent mode in which the idea of religious life is active in our society. What do you, as a Christian theologian, a celebration of the women mystical tradition, how is it you speak to those critics who might be genuinely perplexed by our progressive selves advocating religion as this kind of resource? How do you speak to that word?
I think that reality where religion is destructive is as old as the ancient texts that are gathered in the Hebrew Bible. It is part of our nature. I just never get over the puzzle of this. It is part of our nature to be very attractive to domination and hatred, and to projecting onto ultimate reality those social patterns, those psychological patterns of hatred and domination. And so naturally, religion clothes itself in that desire for domination. It's not new. It's very, very old. As far as I know, it is in some form in almost every tradition. It's our nature to be mixed that way. Paul Tillich writes about the demonic in the religion. He is, as well as anyone I've ever read, is really acutely aware of the way religion itself has this demonic element in it, which is so much more dangerous because the dynamics of evil, domination, cruelty, violence, are given a kind of holy veneer. It's my God-given duty to hate such and such a group of people. So I think we just have to acknowledge that's the case. The way the idea of democracy is, immediately distorted. Doesn't mean democracy is meaningless or it's a meaningless thing to strive for, but we never see it as a realized idea. Gandhi says about religion, about Christianity, what do you think of Christianity? I think it's a great idea. I think somebody should try it. There's always this subcurrent that's also so alive in us. So that when we say, oh, human beings, they're just selfish and everything, basically returns to our selfishness. I don't think that's true. We have this amazing capacity for goodness, and the religions paradoxically are also the container of the most powerful vision of radical compassion, whether it's in Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism or some other tradition. This vision of actually it's radical compassion, that is a universal and unconditional compassion for all beings, that is the spiritual home of humanity. And yes, 1,000 things distort that and prevent us from acting on that, but that is the truth of our being. So religion is both the deposit of thousands of years of this vision, which is beyond the sociological vision of this community needs to care for. It's every single human being. The religion carries that, even as it carries, and perhaps carries more, the distortions. So it's the ambiguity of the human condition, and we have to simply accept that is our condition, this condition of ambiguity. But I don't think that means we have to fail to recognize how the religions also carry this dream. You use the word eschatological. It's a dream. It's an eschatological dream, not only because it's in the future. It's an eschatological dream, this is Levinas's point, because it pierces the present. It's present now. It's not just a temporal eschatology. It pierces the present. The totality will always be the most dominant, but the infinity, to use Levinas's language, the sacredness of the other, our capacity to be compelled to appreciate that's always with us too.
It's, as you know, Levinas is someone upon whom I draw very deeply. And one of the things I love about Levinas is he's able to maintain an awareness of human need and destitution. And yet he'll say that in the very destitution, we also see the height, the glory of the infinite passing in the face of the other. And he calls this holiness, that weird tension of destitution and height at the same time. And it reminds me of something that Simone Weil does a really nice job of in her essay, Love and Affliction, where she's talking about how we love God, and affliction, though we would desire not to experience it, though we wish it weren't true, it's the condition we face more than we would like. And in those moments, it's not just when things are bad, we turn to God. It's in those moments, she says, there's an understanding of the appreciation of a God who walks with, this radical immanence of God as, with us in these spaces, rather than simply lording over and looking down in some sort of providential way. That relational dynamic is something that I have very much clung to over the past 6-7 months in particular, right? Is this isolation, the aloneness, and yet the thought that there is no real aloneness if they is right.
Yes.
If that is the way we understand ourselves. How do you see this? In your book, for example, Gathering Those Who've Been Driven Away, it speaks a lot about those who have been harmed, and the way I might put it is those who live afflicted lives. And the idea is that the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the divine, the Spirit of holiness itself, however we name it, in which tradition, is about communion, about bringing together. And that withness is something palpable in your work. It's palpable in the mystical traditions. How do you see that withness as maybe a resource for a time defined by affliction and very much defined by division, opposition, hostility? Because I think that you, like they, like Levinas, do work that tries to see that withness as intrinsic not only to the human condition, but also to the religious mode of understanding the divine.
your comments make me think of two different things. One is, notwithstanding the distortions we were just talking about, it's the really deep insight of the religious sensibility that the experience of being separated is an illusion. It's a fundamental illusion. And we all experience it to a greater or lesser degree. And we might reify that, and theoretically, by dividing races or political parties, et cetera. But we do experience the centrality of our own experience. And it's natural that, our embodied psychological experience is more vivid than anything else. And in that sense, we're centered in ourselves in a way that prevents us from experiencing the radical connection, which is actually the truth of our being. Fannie Lou Hamer and others are just say this. It's like a bumper sticker. No one is free until we're all free. But it's not a platitude. It's actually a literal statement of our inner connectivity. And that part of what spiritual practice or contemplative practice or even phenomenology do is they try and erode that privileging of the self, which makes us feel disconnected. And one of the most powerful ways the religions have explored that is by saying that experience of connectiveness is really rooted in an experience of connection to ultimate reality. So the more you are transparent to divine reality or the sacred, the greater your power to actually experience the truth of other beings as connected to you, as mattering. So that's this witness, this, the twin love commandment is one commandment, really. They're so knit together that they are completely interdependent. The other point you were making was this sensitivity to the afflicted. And you find this in the prophetic writings of the Hebrew Bible, and you find it in the gospel. As diminished as our access to the gospel is because of distortions in the church, nonetheless, the religion of Israel, and then moving into, out of that into what we are now know as Christianity, is this very sharp awareness of those who are socially afflicted and bodily afflicted. So there's this disconnect between society organizes reality and the way, say, the gospel or the prophetic strands of the Bible orient it. So we think class hierarchy matters. We think that men should rule the world and women should be silent. We think all kinds of things, that we have a social way of organizing reality. And these prophetic strands say, actually, that's completely wrong. That has nothing to do with reality. That these afflicted are, in a particularly strong way, beloved of God. So Abraham Heschel's book on the prophets really pops this out, that we think, oh, it's too bad those people are poor. I'll put a quarter in the little hunger jar. And he says, but for God, this is an obscenity. It's a heartbreaking obscenity. And the way Jesus, in the stories about him in the Gospels, this heartbreak over suffering. You cannot withhold. He cannot withhold his care and response. And it's the afflicted, the ones most despised, that evoke this radical compassion, this pathos. And it is a part of these traditions that is well worth remembering. It's at the heart of them. And Simone Weil is certainly an oracle of that aspect of these traditions.
I recently gave a talk where I was talking about Kierkegaard's notion and distinction between the church triumphant and the church militant, which of course is an old, distinction, and talked about the way that Kierkegaard, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Simone Weil were all, you might say, saints of the militant church, right? They were calling us not to militancy in the sense of, violence, or in Bonhoeffer's specific case, assassination attempts. But instead, it calls us to stand with the socially despised and therefore be militantly opposed to power structures, domination modes that erase and eradicate the religiosity that says, let the kids come to me, right? The model of the Good Samaritan, the model of the prodigal son. These are modes that have somehow been lost as the church, quote unquote, has become more socially empowered, has become, even has gotten a louder microphone, as it were. And so in this sense of, speaking with bluster and speaking with triumphalist, might, that still small voice, that humility that is required for hospitality to become active in our lives, seems to almost have become no longer a virtue, especially in Christianity, right? And I think that one of the things right now, that this is why I was so compelled by your book, Beguiled by Beauty, and we should make clear to the viewers, this is not a book written to academics. It's written to humans, right? To people sharing this condition. And Wendy, you actually told me when you heard I was reading it, you were like, oh, this book's not for you. As if, what I would do is go at it with my critical lens, which unfortunately too many academics do, right? They don't know how to read anymore. They only know how to, attack. And yet when I read it, the patience and the humility that the text invites in us to be hospitable, not only to a God who might not show up as a domineering voice, but might show up as the face of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. To show hospitality to the widows and orphans and strangers because they are beloved by God. And then also to show hospitality to yourself and recognize that appropriate self-concern and self-love has to be one and the same with appropriate other orientation. For me, that humility, hospitality, and gratitude, those three kind of formed, we might say, a existential trinity that results from living this kind of contemplative way of being. And maybe as a final question, how is it then that you would encourage people who are trying to live this, trying to take it up, reading your books or books by the authors we've mentioned? It's not unimportant that Kierkegaard, Bonhoeffer, Simone Weil, Martin Luther King, they all died before they were 43 years old. So living this kind of life puts you at odds with the people who tend to have the power that allows you to, have successful long lives. How do you encourage people, the people in the streets, the protesters, the voices being raised in the name of justice, and also the voices that are in some sense silent but behind closed doors caring for their kids and doing virtual school and working to make sure that they've got enough groceries for their neighbors? Like, this is happening at all levels. What word of encouragement do you find in these traditions upon which you draw that would maybe speak to all of us, all of these people, and say, keep going, keep working, press toward the mark of the higher calling? How is it that maybe you would end our conversation by encouraging all of those?
Well, I'm glad you tossed me a really easy question there at the end. Happy to solve that problem for you. I would want to say, first of all, that it's very important to have the integrity of one's own life. Not to have a fantasy about what my life should be, but to have the integrity of what is my life. There's this Hasidic master who says, when I die, God's not going to ask me why I wasn't Moses, but why I wasn't, in my case, Wendy. So I do think it's not, I think it's very good to be guided by the great heroes. I just listened to John Lewis's interview with Krista Tippett, and I'm still just so deeply moved by this vision of radical non-hatred, which he was able to not just talk about as a strategy, but to live in extraordinarily difficult conditions. But I'm not going to be John Lewis. I'm going to be Wendy. So I need to gather the resources appropriate to me, which might be different from this protester, different from this single mom. I need to gather the resources appropriate to me that will feed my goodness, the good in me. You talked about self-care and care for others. And I think one thing that I would emphasize is those things have to not be separate. Like I'm doing this because it makes me feel good, and then I will go off and fulfill some obligation elsewhere. That's it. We do things that fill us with this spirit of non-hatred, this spirit where you actually are able to lay down hatred, and whatever makes that possible for you, whatever you need to survive with integrity, you need to do those things. And then as you do those things, it will simply flow out of you, the good for others. Because when we have this, I need this and I should do that, it's not well sustainable. You have to feed your heart on whatever feeds it, whatever nourishes it. And that's not identical for everybody. You have to feed your heart. And as your heart is fed, without you thinking about it, you will simply perform the actions appropriate to you in your setting. You can't help but do what's appropriate.
Well, that is such a word fitly spoken, as we used to say in my Pentecostal traditions. And I appreciate you for these words, for your influence and your example. And to everybody watching, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Two Philosophers, One Conversation. May you all find peace in the midst of the whirlwind. May you find joy in the midst of anxiety. And we are more likely to do both when we recognize everyone with whom we share the world as all part of the human condition that defines our existence. Wendy, thank you so much for being with us. To everybody, thank you again for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.